Key Concepts of International Relations Part 5. Dependency theory, a theory that less developed countries are exploited because global capitalism makes them dependent on the rich countries, which creates exploitative rules for trade and production. Dependency, a condition of retarded economic growth believed to result from the Global South's subordination and structural exploitation by Global North's advanced capitalistic market economies, making the Global South especially vulnerable to cycles of expansion and contraction. Dualism, the existence of a rural, impoverished, and neglected section of society alongside an urban, developing, or modernizing sector, with little interaction between the two. Newly industries countries (NICs) and newly industrialized economies (NIs), the most prosperous members of the Global South, which have become important exporters of manufactured goods as well as important markets for the major industrialized countries that export capital goods. Dependent development, the industrialization of peripheral areas within the confines of the dominance-dependence relationship between North and South, which enable the poor to become wealthier without ever catching up to the core global North countries. Semi-periphery, to world system theorists, countries midway between the rich core or center and the poor periphery in the global hierarchy, at which foreign investments are targeted when labor wages and production costs become too high in the prosperous core regions. Asian Tiger, the four Asian NIs that experienced far greater rates of economic growth during the 1980s than the more advanced industrial societies of the Global North. Neoliberal, a perspective that accounts for the way international institutions promote global and prosperity through reforms such as the creation of free market and acceptance of free trade. Non-aligned states, countries that do not participate in military alliances with the rival bloc for fear that formal alliance will lead them to unnecessary involvement in the war. Non-aligned movement, a group of more than 100 newly independent, most less developed states that join together as a group of neutral to avoid entanglement with the superpowers' competing alliance in the Cold War and to advance the Global South's common interest in economic cooperation and growth. Military intervention, overt or covert use of force by one or more countries that cross the border of another country to affect the target country's government and policies. Doctrine, the guidelines a state or an alliance specifies to identify the conditions under which it will use military power and armed force for political purposes abroad. Group of 77, G77, the coalition of Third World countries that sponsored the 1963 Joint Declaration of Developing Countries calling for reforms to allow greater equity in North-South trade. New International Economic Order (NIEO). The 1974 policy resolution in the UN called for a North-South dialogue to open the way for the less developed countries of the Global South to participate more fully in the making of international economic policy. Liberal International Economic Order (LIEO), the set of regimes created after World War II, designed to promote monetary stability and reduce barriers to the free flow of trade and capital. Foreign aid, economic assistance in the form of loans and grants provided by a donor country. Foreign direct investment (FDI), an investment in a country involving a long-term relationship and control of an enterprise by non-residents and including equity capital, reinvestment of earnings, other long-term capital, and short-term capital as shown in the balance of payments accounts. Demography, the study of population changes, their sources, and their impact. Carrying capacity, the maximum biomass that can be supported by a given territory. The tragedy of commons, a metaphor widely used to explain the impact of human behavior on ecological systems that explains how rational self-interested behaviors by individuals may have a destructive collective impact. Ethics, the criteria by which right and wrong behavior and motives are distinguished. Politics, the exercise of influence in an attempt to resolve controversial issues in one's favor. Demographic transition, an explanation of population changes over time that highlights the cause of a decline in birth and death rates so that a country's population achieves a stable level. Modernization, a view of development popular in the global North's liberal democracies which argues that wealth is created through efficient production, free enterprise, and free trade and that countries' relative ability to create wealth depends on technological innovation and education.